Hi, Richard.
Hi, friend. How are you today?
I'm very good. Thank you. Yourself?
Great, great. Thanks.
Excellent. And today we have something very, very interesting because this is something that actually is very hard to explain, which is a return of investment on technology. And
hmm
so I guess actually the first question is what really is return on investment when companies go and buy software or subscribe to software or do these projects. And I think that that's the first. Let's prepare the context, if you may.
Sure. Just like any project, an implementation or the use of a system, something like that, is expected to have a return on the investment that the company is
Yeah.
going to make. Just like any strategy that they're going to execute, any change, any improvement, they expect a return on it, right?
Yeah.
So that leads to the big question. What does ROI actually mean when it comes to tech investment, like a Trinity implementation or a
Yeah.
monolithic ERP implementation? The truth is, it's basically different for every single business. No vendor, no software provider can promise returns, specific returns, until they understand what the business actually values, till they
Right.
understand the as is situation. So, for instance, you can't promise to reduce inventory costs without knowing if they're overstocked. You
Yeah.
can't to reduce maintenance costs if they're not performing a correct amount of maintenance in the first place, right?
Yeah.
It could be that their assets are suffering and they're not doing enough maintenance. So you would improve their asset performance, but your maintenance costs may go up.
Right.
It may be that they don't have enough stock, for emergency spares. So their inventory cost actually goes up,
Yeah.
but their work order execution timeline goes down. You know, uh, it really depends on the customer, right? And what if they care more about avoiding regulatory risk? Or what if stakeholder pressure makes compliance the top
Yeah.
priority? ROI isn't one size fits all, right? It's contextual. And in most cases, the soft returns, cost avoidances, compliance, etc., are just as real as the hard, the hard returns.
Yeah.
So saving time, improving morale, trust in the system, stakeholder trust,
Yeah.
acquiring any one of those could be the return that they're looking for. And that's why, with Trinity, we don't sell cookie cutter like formulaic ROI. We promise something a little bit deeper than that. It's kind of like my ethos. First off, that we care, right? That if the system is not giving a return on your investment of time, then there's no point to it,
Right.
right? It should be saving time. It should be improving compliance. It should be improving morale. It should be protecting staff and leadership. It should be doing a whole bunch of things, right? I also like to promise that we'll listen. We'll learn the business model, right? That's part of our 90-day program is to make
Right.
sure that we understand the business, right? Um, and we can also promise that we've created technical capabilities designed to flex and improve where it matters most to each business.
Right.
ROI is not a claim that anybody can make. It's a collaboration between the providers and the customers.
Right. And I guess that this is coming from a kind of a you've been in a large enterprise. We are talking about mid-market. You've been in a large enterprise environment.
Mhm.
So in that software landscape, certain things I guess that made you observe the current environment, and when going to mid-market, what it feels that is broken or unjust in mid-market compared to large enterprise in terms of
Mm.
return of investment, if you may.
Yeah, look, one of the issues that I observed over 30 years
Yeah.
was sometimes there is whether it's purposeful or not, and let's assume that it's by accident, okay, for the sake of argument.
Yeah.
But the promises during the sales cycle versus the actual things that end up getting delivered, the realistic things within a particular time frame, within a particular budget, the capabilities of the software. in the worst case situation, you can almost have a bait and switch situation where all sorts of modules are present during demonstration, right?
Yeah.
And they buy into a tender, which is constructed to be sold, easily sold and reduce friction. And then later on, they find out that what they saw during that meeting, that's going to cost extra, and that's going to cost extra, and that's going to take more time, and
Right.
that kind of stuff. So sales teams can promise simplicity and quick implementation and outcomes, right? But what can show up sometimes is a system that needs, months of configuration, a couple of
Right.
full-time consultants staying in your office, and then it still falls short. That's the worst case scenario, right?
Yeah.
Underneath all of that is kind of a deeper issue, right? And it's basically goes into the system design itself. Most systems, and I won't name any names, but people
Mm.
are welcome to go out and check for themselves. Most of them aren't designed to be easy to implement or change. Okay? You would assume that they would be, right? Or why wouldn't they be? Okay? It's not an accident. It's a business model. All right? Complexity is profitable. It's just that
Right.
simple. Change resistance leads to more billable hours. And I know that sounds nefarious, but I've been there. I've been there for decades and decades. And I wanted to break that mold, break that model, right? Because the truth is, ease of implementation and change during the project and after is the most underappreciated capability of any system, right? You look at all the bells and whistles features, but how quickly can we change a workflow? Can we do it ourselves? Is it immediate? What happens to orphaned objects that, no
Yeah.
longer have a workflow? How quickly can we change security? Can we do, can somebody else take over somebody else's security? What happens with asset configurations? Yeah,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we change a template, will it change all of the related objects that were created from the template, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? All of that stuff is change management. Can we add a property? Can we add additional attributes to
Yeah.
assets, et cetera, right? All of that kind of stuff. It takes real design effort, right? An interface representing a data table is really easy to do,
Yeah.
okay? The relationships between things, the evolution of things, and how easy you make that. Just for instance, here's a good for instance, all right? During implementation, you got to get data in, right? This is where the saying comes from: garbage in, garbage out,
Yeah.
right? But at that point in time, how difficult are you going to make it to get the data, their existing asset list, into the system, right?
Yeah.
And the reason why people are scared of that particular step is because a lot of systems, it's a direct import of a spreadsheet, and you have to focus a hell of a lot of attention, and you need some skilled individuals looking at that spreadsheet and making sure that everything is going to be a match. And
Yeah.
they run it over and over and over, and you end up having, it can get quite complicated. But what if somebody spent the time to write the code to actually stage that data in the system, automatically analyze each row, and tell you if there's any problems and what the problem is and how to fix it. And until
Right.
you fixed it, you couldn't do the import. So you end up with no garbage in,
So it's
right?
the other way
That
around.
takes that takes extra code. That takes extra time and attention. That takes caring about reducing the billable hours during implementation. Now, when 70% of your revenue is project revenue, which is typical of monolithic ERP systems,
Yeah.
why would you go out of your way to do code and to design technology to reduce your billable hours?
Yeah.
There's no reason why you would, right? And like I say, complexity, making it complex, is profitable, right?
Right. Right.
Ease
Right.
of implementation, those things. most ease of implementation and change management, they're underappreciated capabilities, right? And most platforms kind of skip it entirely, right? They promise an outcome,
Yeah.
and let's focus on that. But getting there it is the part that's fraught with all of the challenges, right?
Yeah.
Getting the system loaded and getting it configured. Very, very often, a customer doesn't know what they want until they see it, right? Now, if implementing a workflow for purchasing is onerous to change, to adapt, to update, to evolve, if it's difficult, costs man hours and it costs consulting time, and et cetera, because it's just not designed to rapidly and easily change,
Yeah.
then either they're going to accept a process that doesn't fit their business, right? Or they're going to deal with much more expense and change requests during the project.
Right.
Yeah. You want to teach a man to fish rather than giving them a meal full of fish. You want to
Right.
show them, their sysadmin how to easily change a workflow.
Yeah.
Then they can change whatever they want. And that would be, that has a process that should be approved, et cetera, et cetera. But it takes more time and attention. And I've dealt with so many of these projects. There was no way I was going to put out software that didn't address these pain points. And I would rather have 10 customers rapidly executed and have their hands on the software
Yeah.
than one big customer that drags on for a year-long implementation.
Yeah.
So it reduces the implementation time and the change management burden, but that just means you have time to handle more customers.
Yeah.
So that's how I feel about that frustrations.
Yeah, and that's probably that's a when you translate that the complexity and not going too far into large enterprises. So the mid market, they are very well known software that the once the initial implementation is done with all these complexities that you mentioned, then are highly dependent on third-party providers like coders or developers just to exactly doing that. Like, oh, I need to change the workflow, I need to update my campaigns, or I need to do something like it's. They are always depending on somebody else that actually more billable hours just to maintain or to hire somebody that's a specialist in that particular software in-house just to maintain the system, which is sometimes defeat the purpose. So that's in that experience with these customers, and particularly when you go into mid-market factories, what do you think is missing or unfair in this case? We mentioned things actually people take as a norm, but is really should be the norm? Like
well, I've spent years inside those kinds of businesses, Frank,
yeah,
especially factories,
yeah,
manufacturers and stuff like that. They don't need dashboards that win design awards. They need systems that work. It's
right,
that simple, right? And yet they're often told to accept tools that don't fit. And this is a lead on from our last thing. Why
yeah,
would they accept a tool that doesn't fit?
yeah,
Because they can't afford to make the bloody thing fit. And
right,
they thought it was going to fit, right? That's what led to our 90-day program was,
yeah,
yeah, you get to observe it. You get to put your hands on it and you only pay if you're pleased, right?
yeah,
But typically they're forced to hire external help to compensate for bad design.
yeah,
Sorry, I said it, right?
yeah,
I've seen the Excel workarounds, the missed inspections, the manual controls, all because the software couldn't do what it was supposed to do. That's not innovation, that's neglect. And quite frankly, I feel very strongly about that.
yeah. And actually, that you mentioned the 90 days program, it starts with an assessment, a full assessment. Nothing moves
Look,
without a full assessment.
I've been in actual competitions with Trinity against blue chip providers that have been around for 30 plus years.
Yeah,
I sent out a 60-question survey, and then we had a meeting to walk through all of their responses
right,
before I could give them a estimate,
right,
right? It made perfect sense to me. Like, how much is it going to cost us? Well, like, how long is a piece of string?
right.
If I don't know how many assets you have, how much stock items, and et cetera, et cetera, there's a whole bunch of questions, and some of them lead to other questions. Do you want this? Do you need that? How many people in this? How many people for that?
Right, right.
What kind of security setup do you want? On and on and on and on. And I won that tender off of the simple fact that the survey and the discussion, they were able to trust my tender because I cared enough to ask about their business.
Yeah.
And I was stunned. They were like, well, at first there was some resistance because they were like, well, nobody else is asking us these questions. And I said, well, what does that tell you? You know?
Right. What happened when I think that you retired a few years ago, or semi-retired a few years ago, and then all of a sudden you're back into back into the game.
Yeah.
So what happened there? Because that's interesting to know. Because actually, there's I think there's a mission there that is beyond what is say the commercial requirement or what you're looking for.
Yeah. Look, I'm not kidding anybody. I'm not a 25-year-old building something in his garage.
Yeah.
I already had a fairly decent and full career. And I was, in that semi-retired space trying to decide what to do next, right?
Yeah.
More or less playing golf at the time. Um, and I was looking back on my career, and there was a certain theme to dealing with other people's software, either from inside a large multinational or, representing the product,
Right.
being part of a software company, right? And throughout all of that time, I was more or less held responsible for poor outcomes caused by some bad design, right? It was very frustrating
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, I can't influence the design of the product, and yet I'm the point of contact when people have a problem with the software,
Right.
right? When it doesn't function, when there's an interruption, or the design isn't quite right, or anything like that, you're held responsible. But you didn't actually create the software. You don't represent, the build
Yeah.
portion of it, right? Anyway, um, when I was on my little bit of downtime, it just struck me. I asked myself a very simple question: could it be done better? And I always knew it could. And
Yeah.
my answer was clearly yes, it could be definitely done better. Certain things could be made easier, certain things could be more configurable as opposed to customizable, that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. But then came a bit of a harder question is, if you think that, why don't you do it?
Right.
Well, that was the challenge. And now we're casting forward a number of years. It, in response to that challenge, I built Trinity.
Right.
Yeah. Not because I needed to, but because I believed the market needed it. There is a bit of altruism there. It's a business, not a baby. Just
Yeah.
like any other software company, we want to sell it. We want to make, a healthy profit. But I believe the best business is when both parties benefit and
Yeah.
both get what they want. And I I started off with a list of things that no matter what features got thrown in, a list of things that had to be resolved.
Right.
And I basically came you know, from the point of view of beginning with the end in mind,
Right.
right?
Right.
Is how would that implementation feel? How would the customer feel about an actual delivery on time, on budget, and that it's in their users' hands in a matter of weeks, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And when you start thinking about the technical challenge and making sure that's possible, that's when I come up with the response I gave you before. Easing implementation and easing change management take a hell of a lot more effort than
Yeah.
just creating interfaces. Anyway, that's I just challenged myself,
Yeah.
and I decided, and it's the old adage. I don't know if you've ever heard this one before. That the definition of an entrepreneur is somebody who's willing to work 80 hours a week to avoid working 40.
Yeah.
And I guess I was just not a good enough golfer to stay
Yeah.
distracted for very long in my semi-retirement. But there is altruism in here. I have actual beliefs that I've
Yeah.
built into the product, and I'm hoping that we can follow through with that.
Yeah.
Even as we grow. But that's the mentality, that care factor that I'll insist is present in our entire sales force and all of our delivery people and our
Right. Right.
support. Yeah.
So that there is like so it's a combination of several things here. So it's a higher purpose. Then you have all these experiences that things actually went wrong in your life experience, and then bridging that to a space which is mid-market, where definitely is in a kind of a limbo, if you may, because actually the amount of apps, small softwares, and or disconnected software to address certain functions, but not the company as overall as a larger enterprise software. So that's how you came up with the idea of the simplifying this platform, that you have the best of the smaller apps with the complexity of the bigger, large software. So how you coded this? Because actually, I guess actually that's not something simple to do. Because beside the knowledge and experience, and some people have the good wish to do something, then you have to materialize it.
Yeah. Well, it turned out that I had enough accounting acumen,
Right.
enough experience in the EAM space, enough experience in the governance, risk, and compliance space that I was able to draw on my understanding of those concerns within a business and how
Yeah.
closely related they are, right? I began with the end in mind of what I wanted the customer experience to be, what outcomes I wanted them to get from the system, and I basically built it backwards over what is typical done.
Right.
So I went from the workflow up. I started with what the user actually needs to get done
Yeah.
and remove everything that got in the way, right? More importantly, like I built it so that you don't need a team on site to implement it, right?
Yeah.
Unless you're physically tagging assets and counting stock items, right? If your system that you're implementing requires people in a room, a project room,
Yeah.
collaborating to implement, if especially if you're mid-market and you have a project team on site that aren't doing physical activity like asset tagging or stock counting, well, something's broken with that software. It's a digital product. It should be fairly easy to implement. Of course, you want to give guidance every
Yeah.
step of the way, but you don't want to be there for a year. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And, you know, resolving issues that I'd experienced over the years, um, you know, and making sure they were all part of the design from the beginning.
Yeah.
The coding is the easy part, focusing on the outcomes and the
Right.
problems that you're trying to solve. You can get distracted by technology, right?
Yeah.
A lot of technically good ideas have no real business justification.
Yeah.
And I saw a massive gap, right? You've got the smaller tools, which have their place, but they're easily outgrown and they're not capable of a great deal of
Right.
complexity. Okay.
Yeah.
And then you've got the big enterprise tools that can be configured to any kind of business anywhere, but they're out of reach budget wise. And
Right.
there's very little in the middle. And, a business doesn't need to be a multinational to have a complex business model. I knew this. So I made sure that it was the user interface for the end user was not complicated, but that the platform was capable of configuration complexity.
Yeah.
That takes more code. I
Yeah.
could have put out a smaller, simpler, less flexible tool much earlier, right? But my MVP was something that could compete for enterprise grade products
Yeah.
in terms of features and configurability, but also compete with the smaller CMMSs in terms of
Right.
price.
Right. And just probably we are running out of time now, but without the hype and just probably the things actually people say are closed doors, but actually we're not hiding anything here. So why is the ROI in markets in particular is misleading companies? So it's there's a reason for that. So it's just a revenue. It's just not for the
Well,
customer,
look,
but it's a lot
most
of hype. Oh,
I get where you're
return
at.
investment. But
Yeah.
sorry, yeah,
Yeah, I get what you're coming to, right? Because most vendors pitch ROI like it's a sales trick,
yeah,
right?
exactly, yeah,
You'll see a 30% gain here,
yeah,
20% reduction there, but they don't even know your business. How could they possibly predict that?
yeah,
So, a business that has some unique challenges or a more complex model than perhaps their size would indicate, they can smell a rat. They know, well, that prediction can't possibly be accurate. You've not
Right.
even spoken to me, right? We don't make those promises. We work with you to define what matters, then support the improvements that align with your reality, right?
Right.
We're partners in that. And whether that's fewer manual workarounds, faster response time, better audit trails, or just better morale for your
Yeah.
staff, the truth is ROI comes from respecting the customer's operations
Yeah.
and building systems and configuring in a way that removes friction. That's the key. And it's not about a percentage reduction, because quite frankly, that's not reducing things and increasing things are only relative to whether they need reduction or increase, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's the way we go about it.
Sometimes these reductions or cost measurements, the only thing they do is to hurt the company because their
Yeah.
operational capacity start to get reduced. So they do cost reductions based on spreadsheets, by the way.
Well,
Uh,
yeah. I mean, think about deciding, well, I'm going to reduce my maintenance expenses by 10%.
yeah,
Without and making that decision without having proper risk management
exactly.
attached and associated with those maintenance plans, right?
Yeah,
You're not going to keep in mind the risk that you're accepting when
yeah,
you make that budget reduction. So promising to reduce maintenance costs, great. It's the easiest thing to do in a business is to refuse to spend money,
yeah,
right? That's not a good strategy. That's a strategy that will reduce the amount of money you're spending. But whether that is necessary for your business to prosper, who
yeah,
knows, right?
yeah,
And that's why I really, really was happy to integrate risk management, governance, risk, and compliance
yeah,
in with all that operational stuff so that you could actually link back the purpose, the purpose for why you had certain
yeah,
expenditures. And so you don't forget somebody leaves a job, somebody else comes in and slashes the budget by 20%, then an asset goes down, and critical spares aren't present. And I mean, this is the kind of stuff that can happen, right?
yeah. Right. Okay, fantastic. So I think that actually this is a very good conversation because we explore what is it, the hype in return of investment. So definitely it's not just an accounting exercise. Well, it's part of that accounting exercise, but actually requires a larger understanding on the back end of all
Yeah.
the implications of those reductions. So committing to a return of investment just for the as a marketing hype, be careful. Be careful because
That's all I would say
yeah,
is if somebody's, it's all relative to your own business model,
yeah,
your own priorities. And it's not very popular for me to just call it out and say anything other than promising to do our best to address the concerns of your
yeah,
business is kind of nonsense.
yeah. All right, okay. Fantastic. So I think now we can close for today, and next week we are going to have another interesting conversation about what is all about our best ideas or knowledge today of how to help companies, really, because we are this is part of a kind of a consulting thing that we do.
Great.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Richard. Talk soon.
Thanks, Fran. Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.